You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast, and today I am so pleased to have one of my newest colleagues with me, bright young mind and keen analyst of the signs of the times, Dr. Helen Baxendale. Helen has taught K-12 history, English, and civics in Australia when she was with Teach for Australia, served as a policy advisor to the Ministry of Education down there in the Parliament, has studied policy at Oxford as none other than a Rhodes Scholar. She served as the Arizona Board of Regents Director of Academic Policy and is now here at Great Hearts, directing our strategy and analytics. I mean, that is literally circumnavigating the globe, my friend. And you found yourself in the Valley of the Sun. What a trip. Well, a warm Phoenix welcome to you, Dr. Baxendale. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be with you, Rob. Very exciting to appear on your burgeoning podcast.
We're doing our best because we're bringing people like you to the attention of our audience. Now, your work with ed policy, let's admit it right up front. This is not something that most of us have delved into, but you've spent your professional life getting to know it and understand how it works. So maybe you can provide us a little primer, right? If you could tell us in a few words, a few minutes here, what's involved and how do we understand the rough outline of education policy and its implications for ordinary people?
Well, it's a very big question, Rob. And I guess, the academic in me would always sort of revert to you and say, define your terms a little better. I mean, it depends a little where we want to start.
Right.
If we're talking the United States and
Yep.
and in kind of recent times, then I guess, I have both an acute professional interest in this, but also actually wrote a doctoral dissertation when I was at Oxford on the kind of last 30 years of American education reform, basically the period spanning, from the advent of A Nation at Risk, that famous report in the early 80s that kind of kicked off a whole chain of standards and accountability type reforms at both state and federal levels through to the sort of the present day. But the real substance of that thesis was about a couple of sort of major developments that I think were coincident and closely linked, which was the advent of the charter school movement in the early 90s, but at much the same time, and then I think serving as a dramatic catalyst for that was the advent of Teach for America, which I think produced a lot of very entrepreneurial and interesting people who have helped to, accelerate the development of the charter school movement. And there's been a lot of, I think, sort of synergy between those two developments. I think what we've seen in more recent times is a certain amount of, kind of retrenchment or, sort of loss of momentum in some of those kind of more centrist, technocratic type, policy reform efforts. And I'd say the momentum of ed reform has really moved back into, sort of the patchwork of state governments and really is involved with further liberations of kind of parent demand in terms of school vouchers, the likes of which we've seen, most radically expressed here in Arizona, and other things of that ilk. So it's it's a kind of a waxing and waning over the last 30 years, and there are some unifying themes. But I think what probably reached its zenith in the Obama era, first term Obama, with things like Race to the Top and a kind of coordinated strategy, partly because it was sort of top down and brought about by the carrot of federal money in the wake of the financial crisis, but I think also because there just was something more of a kind of consensus in ed policy circles at that time has essentially dissipated, and I think we're seeing now much more of a divergence in the directions that states are taking their education systems. I think Arizona has always been a bastion of school choice, but is wildly different in terms of the freedoms that parents enjoy to elect how to school their children than, say, I don't know, Maryland or Connecticut. Whereas I think a decade ago, yes, they would have looked different, those two states, but not nearly as different as they do today.
So this is interesting because, to your good point, educational policy is influenced by federal dollars, right? Monies that are coming into the states, and yet it's to be run and operated per the Constitution by the states. And so there's a certain tension there. And you're telling us now that for maybe 10 or 20 years, maybe more, somewhere in the 80s up and through the early teens, there was something of a consensus that we would rally around standards, we would rally around something that we had in common, because it was a top-down, as you said, because the monies were flowing, right? Race to the top. So for the ordinary folks, we're thinking to ourselves, yeah, our state is figuring this out, but do we have to pay attention to the federal gravy train? Sorry, for the federal monies.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect it,
Mm-hmm.
and what do we need to know about that if we're to understand the way education plays out in our state and local level?
Yeah, well, I think for a long time, the power of the federal government in education has really been the power of the purse strings. As you said, the formal constitutional responsibility for education lies, at the state level and substantively also at the local level through school boards.
Mm-hmm.
But as you correctly note, from sort of the early 80s onwards, there's been increased federal interest in raising of standards, often kicked off by, sort of a panic about, sort of cratering academic standards. It's usually some, sort of measure of proficiency, often, the OECD's PISA tests, for example, or some other metric, or the Sputnik panic, where the United States sort of realized that they were massively behind in this, sort of scientific, sort of space race. So there's now a long pattern of the kind of federal government looking to intervene, and using, sort of money in exchange for, adopting certain policies that they favor. So, the other great example of this is No Child Left Behind. So it's been a bipartisan strategy. It's not simply one that, Democratic administrations have used, but also Republican ones. I mean, No Child Left Behind appropriated massive amounts of federal dollars for states in exchange for them adopting, regular testing and accountability and insistence of certain standards around teacher qualification and so on. And I think there has been in recent times something of a recognition that this sort of top-down, sort of carrot and stick approach is limited in its efficacy. There's a concept in political science called, and in rational choice economics, known as a principal agent.
Mm-hmm.
The principal being the entity that is asking the agents to execute something on their behalf. This idea of delegated authority. And education in the United States, in a country as big and complicated as this, is just sort of the mother of all principal agent problems. So you have a distant federal government that is issuing these sort of mandates and has fairly weak enforcement capacity. Whether and this is true whether you agree with the kind of normative, desirability of what they're trying to do or not. They're just not very effective at actually getting it done. And so they delegate to states, who in turn are delegating to local school boards, who in turn are delegating to a superintendent, a principal, and ultimately a teacher in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And that long chain of delegation has, at every point, all sorts of ways where the agents can kind of defect, wittingly or otherwise, from the wishes of the principal. And so I think there's been growing recognition, and certainly there are some interesting commentators, Rick Hess, who's at the AEI, and J.P. Green at Heritage, have written extensively and very wisely, I think, about the kind of inherent shortcomings of sort of federally imposed mandates, and how they're unlikely to really be realized in the terms desired by those policymakers. So there are both, I think, principled arguments for more local control and devolution in education, and also very practical kind of reality-based ones grounded in political science and in sort of economics.
Tell me, you mentioned that this this really bipartisan consensus that may have lasted for upwards of 30 years, up and through the early teens, as you say, the Obama administration really did grab a hold of standards, testing and assessment, and said, this is how we will move it forward, again, with the carrot of federal monies. But as you suggest, that consensus has dissolved. It is no longer really, it has not held. The center is not held. Could you tell us some of what you think has gone into that? Why is it, in fact, dissolving?
So there were really kind of two strands to this, I think, consensus period of ed reform. There was one, the one you mentioned, which was sort of standards and accountability, and a lot of states, both partisan stripes, adopted, sort of more robust standards through the 90s and noughties, and also more accountability about sort of in some cases teacher contracts were tied to improvements in student attainment and so on. The other strand was really this sort of desire to experiment with competition. And the idea that unleashing competition into public education would sort of raise all boats, and that was most manifest initially in charter schools, which started off in the Midwest. And interestingly, one of these examples that you see not infrequently in education policy of kind of strange bedfellows coming together. It was sort of African American community leaders and libertarian sort of Republican economists who decided that experimenting with charter schools was worth a try, because the local district schools had so poorly served these poor Black communities. And more recently as well, vouchers. Milton Friedman had been sort of expounding these ideas for a long time, but it was it took some time for someone to kind of pick up the idea and first experiment with it in Wisconsin in the early 90s. So I think there are kind of two strands, but what's interesting is that both Republicans and Democrats during that sort of 30-year period were broadly supportive of both of those strands. 2 degrees. There weren't very many Democrats who supported vouchers, but there were plenty of Democrats who were enthusiastic about charter schools.
Right.
And likewise, there were plenty of Republicans who were very much in favor of, the Common Core, and sort of higher standards and accountability and that sort of thing. But what we see from sort of the late Obama period onwards, and what kind of got turbocharged during the Trump presidency, is this complete fracturing of sort of bipartisan consensus over this. I think it started under Obama with disaffection with Common Core and disaffection with kind of federal intervention, and it was in fact sort of states' rights type Republicans who really first kind of started to arc up about some of the deadening hand, I suppose, of Common Core. And you also saw the teachers' unions, traditionally a very strong ally of the Democratic Party, who felt like they'd been kind of stiff-armed a little bit by the Obama administration, really reassert themselves and start to push back against some of the reforms that Obama and Arne Duncan had brought in that they felt were, really adversely affecting their membership. So there's this kind of pincer movement that starts, in the second term of Obama, but with the introduction of Trump and DeVos, blows up, because partisanship just gets kind of turbocharged, polarization gets turbocharged. And I think if you're a moderate Democrat, it soon became politically untenable to say anything nice about a policy that Betsy DeVos favored. So things like ESAs, empowerment scholarship accounts, or as known colloquially as vouchers, and charter schools became beyond the pale for a lot of moderate Democrats. So we've seen this kind of parting of ways. I think what had for a long time been the kind of dominant centrist, slightly center-left consensus in the big philanthropies, in the federal government, in a lot of the kind of major ed reform organizations, the likes of, the Gates Foundation, Teach for America, etc., kind of busted apart and hasn't really come back together again. But in the meantime, we've seen a whole swath of activity at the state level, primarily in Republican states, advancing school choice. So creating better regulation for charter schools and expanding the franchise for school voucher schemes.
This is interesting because the breaking apart of the consensus, as you've just described it, is may indeed leave room for or opportunity for some innovation and some developments that I'd like to explore with you a little further. We have to take a quick break and give a word to our sponsor that we're so proud of. I'll be right back with you, Dr. Baxendale. This episode of the Virtue Podcast is brought to you from the Bria Public Charter Schools, a team of talented and passionate educators. They merge classical education with virtue-based character formation for the underserved communities in the Bronx, New York, and in Paterson, New Jersey. They would love for you to come and see this intentional, joyful culture and the professional development that elevates the way teachers love and teach their students. To learn more about Bria and their mission, you will, of course, want to come to the National Symposium for Classical Education. More on that later, where Bria will be present with its network leaders to answer any questions you might have. Thanks to Bria. Helen, let's get back to Humpty Dumpty. That is to say, in as much as it's fallen apart and the pieces there are lying about us of this consensus, but something is happening at the state level. We've got to figure out how to understand it. Again, what policy means to us who live ordinary lives and have to figure out how to educate our children. You mentioned earlier the American Enterprise Institute's Rick Hess. You also mentioned Heritage Foundation's Dr. Jay Green, formerly at the University of Arkansas. The latter will be joining us along with a couple of the fellows from AEI. They will be joining us for the National Symposium to provide us a little insight, a little exploration of maybe just the big picture, right? Just the kind of thing we've been talking about. But we also want them to take an eye and place their analytic skill in close proximity to the work that's happening in classical education. So I'd like just briefly with you to kind of walk through what we can expect to see from the 4 contributors at this year's symposium, the 4 policy contributors that will be with us. And those are Robert Pontischio of AEI, as I mentioned, Jay Green of the Heritage Foundation, Max Eden, who heads up the Conservative Education Reform Network, also at AEI, and then Lindsay Burke, who's the Director of Educational Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Could we just briefly talk about what each of those has contributed and kind of what we should expect to hear, at least parts of what we will hear at the symposium in February?
Well, thank you, Rob. That's a great introduction to what I'm hoping is going to be a fascinating panel.
That you're leading, I might add. That you're going to be leading.
Yes. Well, moderating at least. I hope it'll be our guests who do most of the talking. So as you mentioned, we have 4 eminent policy experts joining us. I think it's an interesting array because we have in JP Green someone who comes out of the academy, has been a career academic but has subsequently turned to kind of think tankery, and then at the other extreme you have someone like Max Eden, who is a sort of lifelong think tank gadfly. But as a foursome, they really kind of cover the waterfront, I think, in terms of the interesting contemporary developments in education policy right now. Thinking of Lindsay Burke in particular, she has led an interesting research project recently at the Heritage Foundation. This education freedom report card, which I think with Jay Green and others there has really been trying to kind of quantify and then highlight what it means for parents to enjoy kind of freedom of choice over K-12 schooling, and both Florida and Arizona did particularly well in that metric that they revealed, I think late last year. So she's been an interesting contributor on the choice and freedom agenda. She's also recently had some interesting pieces on the problem of education colleges, traditional education colleges, and the way that, sort of teachers are being ill-served in how they're being trained to be teachers, that there's a whole lot of indoctrination and not a whole lot of, sort of instruction in, practical skills of classroom management. So that's an interesting angle that she's worked on.
Helen, let me
Green,
interject here real quickly. Do you remember, because you covered this pretty closely, do you remember if Lindsay mentioned David Steiner and Ashley Berner's work from probably 20 years ago now, where they looked at the content of teacher college or teacher departments in their curriculum? Did she mention it? I'm sorry for such a fine point, but the comment, I'll explain.
Rob, you've caught me out. I couldn't tell you confidently one way or another.
No, the reason I mention it, essentially the emphasis on a kind of a philosophic and ideological reading of education was what Steiner and Berner produced. That must be 20 years ago, and just said, if we want to prepare teachers, we're going to have to get them out of this kind of theoretical and arcane way of viewing education and help them understand what will be needed in the classroom. So it was kind of an aha moment for me as I was working in this area.
Yes, and I think brings us also to another kind of strand of education reform of the last 30 years that I think has been, extremely positive, which has been the advent of kind of alternative certification and sort of non-conventional teacher training programs, of which, Great Hearts is an example. I mean, we take people with BEds, but in general, we're taking people with bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees in real disciplines, and teaching them the kind of practical art of running a classroom and kind of applied pedagogy as they join us. They do a kind of classroom-based apprenticeship, which I think is a very healthy thing. We're by no means alone in embracing that as a way to train teachers, but that is another kind of strand of reform that I think has is identifiable as something distinctive in recent times. But back to our panelists. So yes, JP Green, who's also at Heritage with Lindsay, has also published extensively on the sort of the school choice agenda. And he has recently published a report looking at how state level charter school regulation actually intersects with, how charter schools themselves have a propensity or otherwise to absorb or genuflect to kind of DEI and CRT mantras. And so what he concludes is that in states that have more, sort of liberal charter regulation regimes, the charter schools, the charter management organizations, they tend to be less inclined to lard up their student and staff handbooks with the kinds of DEI mantras that have now become all too familiar to us, and are less inclined to as I said, genuflect to the kind of the CRT overlords than elsewhere. So that was an interesting piece. It certainly kicked off a little controversy online, I saw, unsurprisingly, but certainly an interesting way to link, what is sometimes distant policy in terms, sort of dry state regulation to what is happening actually, every day in classrooms.
And I would add, if I can just interject, Green is going to be on your panel. He's also going to be presenting on some of this research that you've just described, because as I asked him to, I said, diversity is something just that we find in nature, certainly in all species and within the wider world. So we need to understand this better. As you said a few moments ago, we're going to have to define some terms. Jay is going to spend a good bit of time in a talk that he will give on Friday, February 24th, just exploring what real diversity, genuine diversity, might look like in our schools. So that's worth taking a look at as well. Sorry to interrupt you again.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that is happening, Rob, because I think one of the tensions that we've seen and one of the reasons for, this kind of upswell of kind of parent involvement at school board meetings and so on has been because, in part, what seemed like completely benign, indeed even positive terms like, diversity, equity, inclusion, in themselves, these are entirely, benign, even desirable things, but in the hands of sort of education bureaucrats have actually manifested in some really pernicious ways. So I'm thrilled to hear that you will be dissecting all of that with Jay. So another of our guests, our two AEI guests, Robert Pondisio and Max Eden. Robert is a fascinating character. He had quite a successful career as a journalist and in media in New York in the sort of through the 90s and into the early 2000s, and then somewhat abruptly had a real kind of mid-career shift and enlisted in a one of these alternative certification programs, became a grade school teacher in I believe it was Harlem, but certainly a kind of difficult borough of New York, and I think taught fifth grade English, if I'm recalling correctly. And in that period discovered the works of E.B. Hirsch, who is a wonderful sort of commentator on what ailed and ails American education, and Pondisio kind of became a bit of a disciple of Hirsch, and has been, I think, one of the most articulate advocates in recent times for serious reflection on curriculum and just being realistic about what is taught in American classrooms, how teachers are trained, and what sorts of sort of policies and measures are actually stand a realistic chance of positively affecting what is taught and how how effective our teachers are. So he's a very interesting I guess sort of counterpoint to Green and Burke, who have worked more at the kind of high level of sort of demand empowering reforms that kind of liberate parent choice through vouchers and so on. Pondisio is typically focused more at the at the school level, and what is really happening inside those four walls of the classroom, and how is that person in front of your kids being trained, shaped, acculturated, etc. And I would commend to our listeners, Rob, Pondisio's book on Success Academy called How the Other Half Learns, which is a really interesting study of one of the most impressive charter school networks out there, led by Ava Moskowitz. And it's it's nuanced and engaging, and he writes very well, and you'll learn a lot about, I guess, some of these abstract debates about school choice and charter schools, but just far more than that, I think it's a really interesting study of school culture.
He said as much. I've spoken with him repeatedly now, a couple of engagements, and he said, I went in to Success Academies thinking that I was going to write about curriculum. As you just said, he is a true believer in cultural literacy and E.D. Hirsch's project, and knew that Eva was bringing much of that to those academies. He said, I left, having written the book, recognizing that I wrote on school culture. That's what I discovered in spades at Success Academies. So we are delighted to have him come and talk a little bit more about that with us later in February.
Yes, indeed. And our final guest is Max Eden, who is with the AEI. He was prior to that with the Manhattan Institute. And he's recently distinguished himself, I think, as a kind of exposer of the politicization of school curriculum in a lot of cases. He's written a lot of pieces where he's just done a very forensic job of demonstrating, well, these are the materials that are in the school district handbook, or these are the materials that are in the school library, or this is the book that you are that people are raising a ruckus about removing from an elementary school library, and let's look at its contents. By any reasonable measure, this is explicit, pornographic, age inappropriate, etc. And so he has made significant contributions in that vein. Before that, he actually has done some extensive and really quite interesting and nuanced work on school violence and school shootings. I'm not sure we'll have time to kind of get into that strain of his work at Symposium, but if your listeners are interested in that, I would commend Max's work on that aspect of things as well. So I think we have a nice balance in the panel between those who have kind of been interested in these big policy levers like, vouchers, charters, etc., that liberate kind of parent choice over schools, and those who have worked at the more granular level of what is happening in schools every day And I'm hoping that we will thereby be able to kind of draw some nice connections for our audience, which I think is primarily comprised of, sort of school leaders and founders and so on, between the sometimes distant and abstract world of policy and what happens every day in our classrooms.
It's absolutely where we would like to land this. And I know you'll be able to bring those strands together. And I suspect that just having those four in the conversation will, we hope, generate some really interesting points of intersection where big policy and big data connect to, as you've just said, the granular realities on the ground, the things we need to be paying attention to that families rightly are concerned about at this time. Now, that being said, and given this group that we're going to bring together, I really want to know how we might, in the course of conversation, bring them to consider the import of classical education in the movement that seems to be sweeping the nation. There are close to 900 schools nationwide that identify as classical, and a significant number of them, probably well over 250 of them, are charter schools, many of which have popped up in the last 5 to 10 years even. So if these policy analysts can help us to better understand what's at play in our schools and the levers, the principles and agents, as you said earlier, what might we do with this classical movement, and how should we take full advantage of this moment?
Well, that's a fascinating question, Rob. And I think to kind of return to the sort of macro policy theme of the day, I think what we're seeing now is a kind of, maybe not natural, but I think sensible evolution of kind of conservative education reform from what has, I think, traditionally been a fairly agnostic pro-choice position. This idea that, parent demand merely needs to be liberated and the market will create a great array of options.
Mm-hmm.
It will sort of automatically and naturally in time evolve to meet the demands of parents. And I think what we're seeing is, for various reasons that needn't detain us today, that's somewhat naive, or at least hasn't come to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And that as much as these kind of major demand side choice liberating policies are absolutely essential, they are necessary but not sufficient conditions for the sort of education system we might desire. And that really there needs to be a kind of commensurate, coordinated push on the supply side to really get to where we're hoping to go. And that kind of agnosticism has in some ways fallen away in favor of supporting proven models, of which classical education, I'd say, is the preeminent example. So I think there has been an embrace of classical education in recent years, not because it's new, indeed, for the very opposite reason, but because there has been this growing recognition that the supply of good schools matters, and that there needs to be some organization around and coordination around growing the supply of excellent schools. And I think the reason people have sort of gravitated towards classical is no mystery. It's really, I think, for a lot of parents, they don't necessarily know what classical means, but when they peer under the cover, what they recognize is a standard of education that would once have been considered just the standard. They look at it and they think, well, this is the sort of thing that either I was lucky enough to have myself 30, 40 years ago, or this is the sort of education I wish I'd had. And they therefore kind of gravitate towards it. I think it's as simple as that, really. I mean, you, Rob, being the expert in sort of classical ed that you are, could expound, I'm sure, much more fully on what the hallmarks of classical are. But I think in terms of what is our ordinary parent, what is our modal parent who is coming to, say, a Great Heart School, relating to and embracing, I think it's this recognition that there are great, studying the great books is a good thing. That sort of explicit instruction in grammar and syntax, and being able to read, speak, and write clearly is a good thing. And it's no more complicated than that, I think, in a lot of cases. And that is why classical is having this sort of resurgence.
We are certainly pleased and are the beneficiaries at Great Hearts of this renewal and this recovery of a longstanding tradition. It's nice to think that our policy analysts, as exceptionally bright and well-spoken as they are, they may learn a few things when they join us in Phoenix later in February. Namely, they'll be introduced to leaders within the classical movement who themselves are on the ground building schools that are delivering the perennial form that we refer to as classical, and who are eager to take full advantage of this moment. And so perhaps there will be a symbiotic exchange, right, between the leaders of classical, between these leader policy experts, and this will be to the advantage of families across this country. That's our hope. And I know you're eager to get this group together and on the stage later in February. So thank you for joining us today in anticipation of that. And I look forward to working with you in the month ahead.
Pleasure, Rob.
Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.